Today's episode is sponsored by Blinkist, the app that lets you read or listen to an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. You can try Blinkist totally free and get 25% off a subscription when you go to Blinkist.com/David Pakman. I've put the link right below this video. I really sort of went back and forth all morning about whether I should talk about this Bari Weiss situation or not. And I decided to talk about it at least as an introduction into exploring whether some bigger discussion is required. So let me explain to you what's going on, and then we'll talk about it. Bari Weiss was, up until yesterday, a New York Times opinion columnist. And yesterday she wrote a resignation letter, which she published on her website. And the resignation letter led to the entire sort of social media sphere being abuzz. Different people for different reasons, but everybody from, I think Don Jr. tweeted about it, all the way to the folks in the so-called intellectual dark web and sort of like everybody in between. And I think what the letter says is one piece of it, and the reaction is another piece, and I want to talk about both. Now, Bari Weiss was hired by the New York Times in 2017 to write about culture and politics, and she became significantly more well-known when she wrote a widely disseminated piece about the intellectual dark web. And she's appeared on Bill Maher's program, she's appeared on a number of different programs, and when she published this resignation letter yesterday, the social media space exploded for different reasons, but all with the assumption and the understanding that this resignation letter is a bombshell blockbuster indictment of the New York Times and of media, intolerant media more generally. And, during the day, I was seeing this stuff in little fits and spurts, but I was busy with this bogus urgent press conference that Donald Trump held and covering the expanding war between the White House and the medical community on coronavirus. We had another death surge to nearly 1,000 deaths, record deaths in multiple states. We had multiple live streams yesterday. So it wasn't really until last night that I even read the resignation letter. I slept on it. I looked at it again today. And I have to tell you, I've looked at this thing 6 ways from Sunday, I think the phrase is. Excuse me if I've got that one wrong. I'm not sure that there is actually that much to discuss in terms of this being a bombshell, other than it really seems like the New York Times isn't the right place for Bari Weiss to do her writing. Now, I want to be really clear. I don't dislike Bari Weiss, nor do I think her work is bad. I don't always agree with her conclusions, but she's done some reasonable work. She has done some interesting pieces about ways in which anti-Semitism is often ignored, or oppression is not taken as seriously when it comes to the Jewish community. And I've been talking about that for a long time. I think there's different standards there. I think she's reasonably interested in that topic and sort of does pretty good coverage there. She's way off on a whole bunch of other stuff, but that's okay, right? Like, that's not a personal problem I have with her. That would apply to, listen, Andrew Sullivan, who I'm going to mention later, a conservative. Sometimes he says things I agree with. And a lot of what he says I disagree with. It doesn't mean I want him fired or his voice suppressed or whatever the case may be. Now, let's dig into the letter itself. Maybe the most notable part of the letter is a paragraph about the relationship between the New York Times and social media, where she says, quote, "Twitter is not on the masthead of the New York Times, but Twitter has become its ultimate editor. As the ethics and mores of that platform have become those of the paper itself has increasingly become a kind of performance space. Stories are chosen and told in a way to satisfy the narrowest of audiences, rather than to allow a curious public to read about the world and then draw their own conclusions. I was always taught that journalists were charged with writing the first rough draft of history. Now history itself is one more ephemeral thing molded to fit the needs of a predetermined narrative." In another paragraph, she sort of seems to issue an indictment of what was allowed to take place at the New York Times, and says that, quote, "Showing up for work as a centrist," referring to herself, "showing up for work as a centrist at an American newspaper should not require bravery," clearly implying that the New York Times has become some kind of radical left-wing publication, and her centrism required her to be brave to show up in the face of and despite recriminations and all sorts of attacks on her, not physical but ideological. So in general, she is arguing that the New York Times increasingly is catering to a very narrow audience, and that anybody looking to put out something outside of that narrow scope of opinion is just like not really allowed or welcome at the New York Times, both from the point of view of the publication, but also just in terms of her feeling like she was just not treated particularly well at the New York Times. She wasn't in the in crowd at the New York Times because of her differences of opinion, which to me relates more to a toxic work environment than it is a criticism of the New York Times as a journalistic institution. And that's where I get to my first sort of primary point here. When you see a letter like this, and then you start reading the responses, often the responses are very generalized. And it's sort of like, are people responding to what she says about the New York Times as a media outlet or what she says about the New York Times as an employer? Because toxic work environments are unfortunately very common. And we need to distinguish in looking at her letter, what is she asserting about how she felt while working at the New York Times, which is completely valid, and what are her criticisms about the New York Times as a media institution, which can be argued and are up for debate. I mean, for example, she argues that the New York Times is now catering to the narrowest slice of the political spectrum. If that's the case, it would be reflected, presumably, in decreased viewership of the New York Times because it appeals to a smaller and smaller slice of the population. So we could look at that empirically. I happen to know what the answer is, but I don't think it's particularly relevant to this story. But the New York Times is actually doing quite well. Now, you could argue, well, it's because they've decided just to criticize Trump. Okay, but now we're in a gray area all of a sudden. There's some interesting criticisms that I want to look at that focus on the media piece that are much more broad than the New York Times. But the bombshell about the New York Times that some are pointing to here, I'm just not seeing it. Now, first and foremost, from the point of view of opinion, the New York Times is basically a center-left publication. They've correctly, listen, to say they're biased because they do a lot of Trump critiques, Donald Trump is a uniquely bad actor who has done things no president has done before, where every week, never mind, sometimes every day, there's a new scandal. So the New York Times, as a center-left paper that also does investigative journalism, has been correctly criticizing a lot of Donald Trump's presidency. And remember, there was no big pro-Bernie voice at the New York Times. There was also no big pro-Trump voice at the New York Times. And that's the point. It's center-left, sort of in line with MSNBC, but they do more investigative journalism, which is a separate department than the opinion side. The New York Times, from an opinion perspective, seems widely in line with the Democratic Party. Both are center-left. Now, if your problem is, I don't want the New York Times to be center-left, okay, that now we can talk about that. But the New York Times as some radical place is just wrong. It's empirically wrong. Secondly, there's the idea of what is considered outside the Overton window for the New York Times. And Bari Weiss talked about this. What is or isn't acceptable to say or publish at the New York Times? And from Bari Weiss's perspective, the Overton window is too narrow at the New York Times. It doesn't include certain perspectives. And as a result, she feels like her work was demeaned and not maybe given the placement or seriousness that she believes it deserves. That's completely legitimate. And it genuinely does seem like her work was not best placed at the New York Times. But that's not strikingly different from saying the National Review wouldn't be the right place for a lot of stuff. Fox News is not the right place for a lot of stuff. I believe Bari Weiss is genuine when she says that the environment at the New York Times was not the right place for what she writes. And I still want her to write. And it's okay if the New York Times isn't the right place. She also says that the work environment was hostile in a day-to-day perspective. And I have no reason to doubt that. There is no shortage of toxic and hostile work environments. But let's not mix the two things. And importantly, she wasn't silenced. She wasn't fired. She determined she didn't like the work environment and the way which her work was received. And that's a very different thing than the bombshell that many people are making this out to be. Now, there's a separate issue here, which we have to talk about in terms of her criticism of the New York Times as a journalistic endeavor. And there's no shortage of criticism of the New York Times. And in general, I agree that too many media outlets are catering to social media as a primary doorway to their content, and social media and shareability of content and journalism has changed how the New York Times and just about every media outlet behaves. But that is not the widespread indictment that maybe some are making her letter out to be. So in total, as I read the piece, I see very little that's unique to the New York Times other than Bari Weiss worked there. And her relationship to the Times is different than to the National Review or some other publication. Every media outlet has biases which come from ideology or corporate structure, from availability bias, from a desire to maintain access to people in positions of power, whatever else. Maybe at the New York Times, the bias has sort of one shape. At the Wall Street Journal, the bias has a different shape. At the Washington Post or the Washington Times or Fox News or CNN or the David Pakman Show, biases are shaped in different ways. That's a big, complex issue that's widely studied in media literacy classes. But the idea that some journalistic outlets don't want a full range of political opinion represented, that's not new. I mean, that applies to us, right? I control the preponderance of certain types of ideas that are put out on my program. I exclude some stuff. There's some stuff that would be a bad fit for this program. If it didn't work out for Bari Weiss at the New York Times, she's completely right to leave. And her critique of how she felt from a personal perspective there is completely valid. But I don't see the bombshell here that many are making it out to be. I'm willing to have my mind changed. Now, one last thing. Andrew Sullivan has also announced that he's leaving The Atlantic at the end of this week. I would not be surprised if there's some announcement coming about some new endeavor where Bari Weiss and Andrew Sullivan and maybe others are going to be involved. We'll see if we soon learn about that. We're seeing something very interesting happening over the last 24 to 48 hours in the United States. On the one hand, you have Donald Trump and the administration and even many Republicans insisting everything must open. Disney World must open. Schools must open. And of course, it doesn't really make sense because if schools had to close when we had 100,000 active cases, it's not really following that it would be safe to then open the schools when we have 2 million active cases or close to it. But what's very interesting is that the country, fortunately, seems to be leaning in the direction of reality and scaling back plans to open rather than following the obvious lies of Donald Trump and opening more and more. And why would they follow Donald Trump? Over the last 48 hours, the Trump White House has released a list of things Dr. Anthony Fauci got wrong while Donald Trump was retweeting the conspiracy theories of former game show host Chuck Woolery. Governors and also many mayors, however, have to deal with the day-to-day of increasingly full ICUs, increasing hospitalization rates. The mayor of Houston, Texas, Sylvester Turner, who's a Democrat, is proposing a strict 2-week shutdown. Even the Republican governor in Texas, Greg Abbott, is talking about stricter guidelines. They've put in a mandatory mask order. In California, over the last 2 days, we've seen the Democratic governor, Gavin Newsom, say indoor restaurants have to close again, close wineries, close movie theaters, close zoos, museums. Certainly bars must close. Los Angeles and San Diego are saying we're not opening schools. The fall semester, the school year in the fall is going to start online only. Oregon has said once again, no gatherings of more than 10 people. Kentucky Fried Chicken, or I guess now it's just called KFC, they are telling franchises in a lot of these states, you've got to stop indoor dining. And this makes sense. And even the economic arguments fall short because the short-term benefit of opening things too quickly is going to backfire. It's going to evaporate, and you're going to end up with a much worse economic situation if you have a big relapse effect. And in the end, the long-term results are going to be based on flattening the curve in a serious manner. But that's not this administration's priority. Trump's priority is getting reelected in November. That's his gambit. His idea is anything I can do in the next 3.5 months that will make it seem as though life is returning to normal will benefit me politically. And that is the only thing that he cares about. Now, unfortunately, the timing hasn't worked out because instead of a nice gap now leading into the election with few cases and few deaths, we're seeing a massive resurgence, which shouldn't surprise us because when we got down to 20,000 cases a day, states went crazy reopening, and now we're seeing that resurgence. Now, I'm going to be totally upfront with you guys about something because this came up on the bonus show yesterday, sort of briefly, and people wrote to me and they said, David, we want to hear more about this. I know some people may be mad because not everybody's in a position to be able to do this because they have different types of jobs. Things are potentially going to get so bad here in the United States, and it's even going to bleed into Massachusetts. I am seriously looking at finding is it possible I could do the show from somewhere else in the fall where I could get a break from what's going on in the United States and just be somewhere else? And by that, I mean another country. Now, of course, the problem is Americans are banned from much of the world right now because it's so bad here. So I've not looked into it in a huge amount of detail. But would it be possible to put the mask on, take a coronavirus test, quarantine 14 days, and if I'm going to be, just buckling in and riding it out for 3 or 4 months, maybe that is something I would actually be interested in doing, because the reality is what it increasingly looks like is the best case. It takes 2 months for a lockdown to have a big impact. We saw it in New York. If Texas, Florida, et cetera, locked down today, we're looking at large case numbers at least until mid-September. They don't look like they want to do full lockdown. So we could be looking at this going well into the fall. If Joe Biden wins in November and we get the most optimistic timeline with an early use vaccine for healthcare workers at that point in time, optimistically, things aren't going to really dramatically improve until early 2021. That's just an unfortunate reality. Joe Biden will hopefully take over then. Treatments and vaccinations will hopefully start to become a reality. In the short term, hopefully we see governors and mayors do the right thing. But when you're seeing 5, 7, 10, 15,000 cases a day in some states, like we're seeing right now, the best case is you need months to come down from numbers that high. And I understand that I'm truly privileged to live in Massachusetts. I can't imagine what my friends in Florida, Arizona, California, Texas are going through right now. And it's going to remain incredibly ugly for a long time. If there's any good news, it's that some governors and mayors seem to be taking this seriously. Let me know what's going on in your city or state. I'm on Twitter at @dpacman, and remember to get the daily audio podcast on Spotify, Stitcher, iTunes, Google Play, wherever you prefer to listen to your podcasts.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
What if you could read 10 books in just one sitting? That's exactly what one of my favorite apps lets you do. It's called Blinkist, and what they do is take thousands of popular nonfiction books. They condense them down into text or audio that you can consume in 15 minutes. Blinkist makes sure that you're getting all of the important core insights from each book. So it's perfect for exploring a book you otherwise wouldn't have time for. If there's a full book you're thinking about buying, you can use Blinkist to get a sample first. Just think how much you can enrich yourself by being able to soak up an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. I recently read A Brief History of Time, of course, by the great Stephen Hawking. This is a book that I have been aware of for so long, and other things got in the way. And it was fantastic to check it out on Blinkist. Blinkist has books on politics, philosophy, science. They have 27 different nonfiction categories, and a subscription is only about $8 a month, and you get the entire library. But you can try it totally free and get 25% off a subscription when you go to Blinkist.com/David Pakman. I've put the link right underneath this video.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Today's new members of the day are Joseph Fazio and Lance Herring. Thanks, Joseph and Lance. Also, a big thank you to David Hackett, who is today's longtime sustaining member of the day. Remember that membership is the #1 funding source for the podcast, the YouTube channel, the live streams, the newsletter, all of the different things that we do. You can sign up at joinpakman.com. It's quick, it's simple, it's easy, and it's a beautiful thing. It's been a couple of weeks, but it is time for Hatriot Mail. What is Hatriot Mail? Here's a reminder.
If you're allowed to shop for luxuries like food and medicine, then we should be allowed to clap our hands together in a megachurch. Hatriot Mail. Written by patriots who hate David Pakman. Because America. And because freedom.
This one is pretty brutal. The anti-Semitism is back in full swing. Take a look.
I'm more tired of this Jew, David Parkman, than I've ever been. Why are Jews so opinionated? One Jew, two opinions. Two Jews, four opinions. Four Jews, eight opinions. Exponential! But this guy is a denier of Christ. So of goes with the territory. A Jew from Argentina. Imagine that. Trespasser on top of everything else. I admit though, Hispanic Ashkenazi, he's damn handsome. Hate him though.
This person seems strangely attracted to me despite their anti-Semitism. That's kind of different, I guess. The hate mail lately that I've been getting, it's a lot of mask and economy stuff. It's kind of conspiratorial. It's overwhelmingly, I'm part of some conspiracy to shut down the economy, to hurt Donald Trump. Coronavirus is a hoax. Masks don't do anything or may actually be killing people. That's been a lot of it. And no good conspiracy theory in the United States is missing anti-Semitism. So a lot of it is tied into it's the Jews who want people wearing masks, or it's the Jews who want to shut down the economy, or whatever. It's very, very vile stuff. But remember that you can fight hatriotism by using the coupon code Hatriot40 to get a 40% discount off of the membership of your choice at joinpakman.com. You save 40% with the coupon code Hatriot40. The Hatriots cry, and independent media benefits. That's spelled Hatriot40. I've been suspecting more and more over the last few weeks that Donald Trump may not realize that in the context of voting in November, absentee ballots and mail-in ballots are exactly the same thing. Now, Donald Trump hasn't specifically said absentee is fine, but mail-in is bad, or at least he hadn't up until a few days ago. But in his attacks against vote by mail and his defenses of absentee voting, I got the sense that Trump seems to think we're talking about two totally different things. We've now removed all doubt. Donald Trump does think absentee ballots and mail-in ballots are two different things, one of which is fine. The other is totally subject to rampant fraud. Now, remember that the context of this entire anti-vote by mail thing, it's related to coronavirus. The idea is it may be too dangerous to go out and have large crowds voting in November. We're going to be in the middle of a pandemic. In all likelihood, some states will be worse off than others. And we should allow anyone who wants to vote by mail by getting an absentee ballot. Mail-in ballot, absentee ballot, in this context, it's the same thing. Now, I want to issue one caveat because I know I'll get some trolls or maybe people just genuinely misunderstanding. In theory, if there was just regular vote by mail as a matter of course, rather than a process for voting by mail through absentee ballots, there could be a difference between people are allowed to request an absentee ballot versus an entire state or country switches to exclusively voting by mail as a matter of course. Those could be different things. For November, what we're talking about is just expanding absentee ballot access to anybody that wants an absentee ballot. So with that context, check out these quotes, these tweets from Donald Trump, where it's clear he thinks these are two different things. He says, quote, mail-in ballot fraud found in many elections. People are just now seeing how bad, dishonest, and slow it is. Election results could be delayed for months. No more big election night answers. 1% not even counted in 2016. Ridiculous, just a formula for rigging an election. Absentee ballots are fine because you have to go through a precise process to get your voting privilege. Not so with mail-ins. Rigged election, 20% fraudulent ballots. So Donald Trump clearly believes these are two different things. It sounds like he thinks an absentee ballot is something you request, but a mail-in is you just get it somehow. You don't have to go through some kind of process. So remember, for November, in the United States, what we're talking about is expanding vote by mail by allowing anybody who wants an absentee ballot to get one. Normally, to get an absentee ballot in most states, some states have open absentee ballot requests. Normally, to vote by absentee ballot, you have to meet certain criteria. Either you have a medical condition where you can't go to the polls, you're living elsewhere temporarily, you're living out of the country. There are sort of reasons. You still go through the same application process, though, if you expand absentee ballots to say anybody can get an absentee ballot. So there's sort of a few layers here. One layer is you say anybody who wants an absentee ballot is allowed to request one, no matter what the reason. That would be one way. The next layer would be every registered voter gets an absentee ballot application automatically. If they want to vote absentee, they have to return that application. In any case, this is all totally simple, standard stuff. Now, again, in theory, you could have a 100% vote by mail system that is not merely an expansion of the absentee ballot system that we have. That's not what we're talking about for November. We do not have that. Nobody is talking about that for November. For November, we're talking about anybody who wants an absentee ballot can request one. In some states, hopefully, every registered voter will be sent an application. It is not every person. Trump wants to make you believe that, hundreds of thousands of undocumented immigrants who are never registered to vote because they can't vote in California are going to be sent absentee ballots. No, applications or ballots will be sent to registered voters. Now, I was thinking maybe the move here is to placate Trump. Imagine Democrats go to Trump and they say, sir, as he likes to say, you're right. Vote by mail is too dangerous. You win. Instead, we're going to just expand absentee ballots. We're not going to do vote by mail. We'll expand absentee. Is he that uninformed that maybe he would go for it? Now, the reality is that Trump wants absentee ballot voting or vote by mail for himself. He wants it for his family. He wants it for Kayleigh McEnany. He wants it for people planning to vote for him. He does not want it to be easier or safer to vote for people planning to vote for Joe Biden. At the core of it, yes, Trump is ignorant. Yes, Trump seems to think there's a difference between absentee ballots and mail-in voting in this particular election. But ultimately, what this is really about is Trump is losing on the issues. His polling is in the garbage. And he's looking to win in other ways. And suppressing turnout is a great way for Donald Trump to try to win. We can't allow it to happen. We have to so overwhelm the vote in November that none of these garbage techniques are going to work. And that depends on every single person voting and getting out the vote. That's ultimately what this is going to come down to. We know they're going to try to suppress. We know they're going to do everything they can. What October surprises can they put? They're going to do it all. They're going to throw everything at the wall and see what sticks. We just all have to vote. That's the way. If enough of us vote, it won't be enough. We will overwhelm all of those tactics that they are going to apply. We're going to have more of this topic and discussion on the David Pakman Show Instagram page. That's David Pakman Show on Instagram. Make sure you're following us there. And for the latest garden updates, you should see what's going on with my zucchini. It's like nothing I've ever seen before. Doctors were shocked at how my garden has aced zucchini growing. Follow me on Instagram for those updates at david.pakman.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show depends on your support, and the easiest way is through membership, which includes the world-famous bonus show, as well as commercial-free audio and video streams of the show just for members. Sign up today at joinpakman.com. Coupon code saves you 40%. Vote soon 18.
Welcome back to the David Pakman Show.
Yesterday afternoon, I got back from just a beautiful bike ride here in the city of Boston, and I was not planning on doing a live stream until our chess tournament later at night. But it was announced that Donald Trump called an urgent press conference set to start at 5 p.m. Eastern yesterday. And this was pretty unusual. It hadn't been on the schedule for the entire day. and it was framed as urgent and potentially bringing some kind of big announcement. I decided to do a live stream because if there's something major that's going to happen, let's see what it is and share it with the audience. And we wondered, maybe they're announcing a second stimulus package. Maybe there's some kind of big announcement related to coronavirus. What could it be? It seems like something big is going on. So I did a live stream, and clearly news of this urgent press conference spread widely, because instead of having our normal 6,000 to 8,000 viewers on YouTube, we had more than 40,000 people watch the live stream concurrently across our platforms. And it ended up being more than an hour of Donald Trump wildly and belligerently attacking Joe Biden in a completely incoherent manner, followed by taking just 3 questions, not really answering any of them. And one of those 3 questions came from the outrageous propaganda right-wing news outlet OAN. And this was actually so insane and so unprecedented that even Fox News anchor Brett Baier had no choice but to mention, listen, Barack Obama did this. Barack Obama called an urgent press conference at the White House and delivered what was essentially a campaign speech attacking his opponent. Even if it was a poor campaign speech, Republicans would have lost their minds, saying it's an abuse of power, it's an abuse of the status of the White House. Here is Brett Baier actually being honest and saying it.
He spoke for 52 minutes before taking a question. Presidents in the past, by tradition, have stayed away from overt campaign rhetoric from the Rose Garden or the White House, but it is the president's discretion. It is worth noting, however, to be fair, that had President Obama made this kind of speech from the Rose Garden, Republicans on Capitol Hill would likely have been up in arms. But this comes 112 days, 16 weeks to the day before Election Day.
Even Brett Baier realizes this was hugely outrageous, and Republicans are major hypocrites. Now, of course, there are people talking about the legal question, like, is this using taxpayer money for campaigning, in the sense that this was really a campaign event where the focus was attacking Trump's opponent, but it was at the White House with the White House press corps, not campaign people covering the campaign. But as good of an argument as that might be, I just wouldn't focus much on it because it's going nowhere. The focus really should be that this is a very desperate Donald Trump that clearly nobody around him can control. And I know that Trump has a lot of very bad people around him whose instincts are terrible, but it's hard to imagine that even they would be supportive of this. It genuinely seems like on a whim, sometime around 4 p.m. Eastern yesterday, Trump said, put together a list for me of things I can say about Joe Biden, and let's call an urgent press conference. And then I'm just going to go out there and read the list. And that's how poorly it came off. Trump was asked about the fact that his polling is in the toilet. And Trump mentioned, you know, there are some Floridians with boats who seem to like me. I'm not kidding. That was Trump's answer to one of the few questions he took.
I think we have really good poll numbers. They're not suppression polls. They're real polls. You look at the intercoastal in Florida. You look at the lakes. You see thousands of boats with Trump signs, American signs. You've got the Trump Pence sign all over. You look at what's going on. You look at bikers for miles and miles riding up highways proudly with their signs.
Thousands of boat owners in Florida love Trump. That's his answer when faced with polling data and discrediting the polls by saying they are suppression polls. Trump wildly, after stumbling over an acronym, claims that Joe Biden wants to end the suburbs. Take a look.
Abolish in the suburbs. You're going to abolish the suburbs with this. Enforce Obama Biden's radical AFFH. That's the AFFH regulation that threatens to strip localities of federal affordable housing funds unless they change their zoning laws to fit the federal government's demands. So what you have, I mean, I've been watching this for years in Westchester, coming from New York. They want low-income housing built in a neighborhood. Well, I'm ending that rule. I'm taking it out. So I spoke with Ben Carson the other day. We're going to be taking it out. I've watched that whole thing go, and now they want to make it twice as bad in the suburbs. In the suburbs. Mothers aren't happy about that. Fathers aren't happy about that. They worked hard to buy a house, and now they're going to watch the housing values drop like a rock, and that has happened.
Trump just barely able to get through the reading, but says Joe Biden wants to end the suburbs, just kind of aimlessly stumbling around. Here's just like a random 60 seconds where you'll notice Donald Trump is just jumping from topic to topic with no rhyme or reason, making absolutely no sense. And I believe this is the clip where you get a shot of the press and they're just still. They're like statues. They don't know what the hell is going on.
Many countries, and I did this myself for the most part, not to use Huawei because we think it's an unsafe security risk. It's a big security risk. I talked many countries out of using it. If they want to do business with us, they can't use it. Just today, I believe that UK announced that they're not going to be using it. And that was up in the air for a long time, but they've decided. And you look at Italy, you look at many other countries. We withdrew from the Chinese-dominated WHO, and we fully rebuilt the United States military, the WHO, World Health Organization. We were paying close to $500 million a year. China was paying $39 million a year. And China had too much say. They worked it very hard, which is a bad thing done by our past administrations. But we were tough, and we were saying, I said, why are we paying so much more than China?
Just all over the place. I mean, really, really bizarre. Just one other clip for you here. Here, Donald Trump claims, this is so crazy. He claims that Joe Biden is against Windows. I'm not talking about the Windows operating system. He's not saying Joe Biden's a Mac guy. He's saying if Joe Biden were president, buildings wouldn't have windows, heating, cooling, or lighting.
Mandate net zero carbon emissions for homes, offices, and all new buildings by 2030. That basically means no windows, no nothing. It's very hard to do. I tell people when they want to go into some of these buildings, how are your eyes? Because they won't be good in 5 years. And I hope you don't mind cold office space in the winter and warm office space in the summer, because your air conditioning is not the same as the good old days.
This is so crazy. And it reminds me of what I think at this point, I don't know if it was like 6 months ago or a year ago. Remember that rant where Donald Trump said, Democrats don't want you to have good flushing toilets. Like it's just stuff about water pressure and sinks, just really, really bizarre. So what we had here in the end is that Donald Trump manipulated reporters to get them to go to the White House, to rant to them about Joe Biden. And if I was on the fence about voting for Trump, I mean, listen, I know that if you're in the tank for Trump, you don't care. You probably didn't even watch this. In fact, there's a lot of Trumpists who, in order to avoid being confronted with his incompetence, no longer even watch Trump's public-facing events. They're just voting for Trump. They don't want to hear anything else about it. If you were already not voting for Trump, obviously this press conference, this ranting is not going to convince you to vote for Donald Trump. I'm imagining, even though I don't really get how anyone could be undecided at this point, if you were one of these undecided voters, could this possibly convince you to vote for Donald Trump? And if, again, I don't know how anyone is undecided. I'm not sure if there's any of these undecided voters in my audience. But if you are one of those people, I would love to hear your perspective on Trump calling an urgent press conference at the last second and then struggling to read criticisms of Joe Biden off of his pieces of paper. It is very, very bizarre. Before we go to a break, I do have kind of a cool announcement. As some of you know, I am a very bad amateur chess player. And over the last few months, we've engaged with our audience by occasionally running a chess tournament. We had one last night with 728 players. It was a great time. Apparently, word of my amateur chess playing has gotten around, and I have been invited by chess.com to be one of 16 participants in a chess tournament next month called PogChamps 2. PogChamps 1 was last month. Grandmaster Hikaru Nakamura reached out to me. I said I would love to do it. The chess.com team reached out to me. I said I would love to do it. So that's where we are right now. I have been assigned excellent professional chess player coaches to coach me from the standpoint of being a participant in this tournament. And I am probably going to be doing most of the coaching sessions over on Twitch. And the first one is tonight at 8:30 p.m. Eastern. So this is not going to be like the normal, oh, my Sharpie is collapsing. This is not going to be the normal sort of stream. This is going to be Twitch only tonight at 8:30, and it will be the start of my journey in preparing for this tournament that will be taking place in August. So join me tonight on Twitch at twitch.tv/David Pakman. I will be introducing you to my first of two, actually really three different chess coaches that I'm going to have. I'm that bad that I need multiple coaches, sadly. But it'll be a good time. It'll be a nice break from all the politics tonight. So we'll take a quick break. I will see you in just a couple of minutes, but then hopefully tonight as my chess Pog Champs adventure begins.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
The David Pakman Show depends on the support of our viewers and listeners, and one way to keep us going is through Patreon, where you can pledge as little as $1 per month or as much as you want at patreon.com/David Pakman Show. Great perks and benefits as well. Read about them.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
We've been wondering for a while now and sort of asking questions about whether we can trust the coronavirus numbers that we're getting. And part of the reason why that's been in question is that there have been reports that individual states were choosing to suppress data. Maybe not so much about cases, but possibly about deaths. Florida was one place where we heard those allegations made very specifically. But now we have to talk about this at the federal level, because there are growing reports that the Trump administration is coordinating a suppression effort to prevent the real numbers about coronavirus from getting out. And we've actually gotten our hands on a memo that was sent out, which specifically says to hospitals, as of today, July 15, stop sending the data to the CDC. Instead, send it to the Department of Health and Human Services, run by Trump tool and sycophant Alex Azar. This is exactly what we predicted might happen months ago if the numbers did not improve. The New York Times reported yesterday that hospitals have been ordered to bypass the normal process. The normal process is hospitals report to the CDC, and they were told, send us all of your data. Send it directly to the Department of Health and Human Services. This is the opposite of transparency. This opens the door to just hiding the data. And health experts obviously are alarmed because they know exactly how this can go. Now, we eventually got a copy of the order from the Trump administration. And what the document says to hospitals is, don't send your information to the CDC, send it to us. And of course, that is a department, the Department of Health and Human Services, that is run by the guy Trump picked and who has been brown-nosing Trump since the start of this pandemic. And in all of history, since the CDC was created, pandemic data, health data, like what we're dealing with today, goes to the CDC. The Kaiser Family Foundation, which has no connection whatsoever to the insurance company Kaiser Permanente. The Kaiser Family Foundation says, quote, this is Jen Cates, the director of global health and HIV policy. Jen Cates says, historically, the CDC has been the place where public health data has been sent. And this raises questions. I love the understated nature. This raises questions about not just access for researchers, but access for reporters, access for the public to try to better understand what is happening with the outbreak. How will the data be protected? Will there be transparency? Will there be access? And what is the role of the CDC in understanding the data? Now, you need only zoom out like the tiniest bit to understand what is most likely going on here. Donald Trump admitted that he wanted to slow down testing in order to cover up the reality of the pandemic. Remember, he said, one of the reasons we have so many cases is we have so many tests. Now, this ignores a whole bunch of realities. In fact, if you don't test, it doesn't affect the real number of cases, except it probably increases the real number of cases because without testing, people don't know they have the virus and they go out and they spread it. So not testing actually spreads the disease. Additionally, as testing has gone up in many of the states that are worst affected, the positivity rate has gone up. If you go from 5,000 to 10,000 tests a day, and you go from having 2% of the people test positive to 4%, that is a signal of a growing epidemic. This is all way beyond Donald Trump. He doesn't seem to understand any of this stuff. So the point is, once you understand Trump admitted to wanting to slow down testing, to slow down case numbers, and you see that the Trump administration is saying to hospitals, don't send your data to the CDC, send your data to Alex Azar at HHS, the obvious next step is to start covering up this data, cover up death data, cover up hospitalization data. The White House is trying to muzzle the normal reporting process. And the only reason that that exists is to suppress information. If he can't stop the testing, he'll stop the information. Now, I'm hoping, I don't know. I've talked to a few people today and they have different opinions. Like, could this work? Because there are other ways to get the data out. Media will talk to hospitals, and hospitals will say, we're full. We have no room in the ICU, for example. And at a certain point, if the data that the Trump administration is allowing to be published says one thing that goes completely against what the ICU information is, at a certain point, you would hope that it would explode, that the real data has been covered up. I don't know. I mean, I'm hopeful that this can't really be covered up to this degree. But the administration has decided the numbers must go down. The numbers have to go down for the benefit of Donald Trump's reelection. Here's one way to do it. Now, what we can hope for is that we still find the data and that Trump is punished electorally for trying to suppress the data rather than dealing with the pandemic itself. It's too early to know which way it will go because the directive starts today. It's effective as of July 15th, so we'll have to see what happens. But what we need to understand is that from this point forward, from as if this wasn't already the case in many of the states in the United States already, from this point forward, we have to realize that the numbers that make it out may not be the real numbers, because the idea is hide the data to justify a faster economic opening to help Donald Trump get himself reelected. His reelection is the most important factor. It's far more important than American lives. And it's really the only thing you need to know to understand how to analyze the actions of this administration. It seems to run counter to health. It seems to run counter to common sense. It seems short-sighted in terms of the economy because the relapse effect will hurt the economy. You just have to understand, Trump thinks it might help him get reelected in November. That's all that's going on. The pandemic response has been blown so badly that there's really no way to fix it before the election. I was looking at some data today, and this is important for you to understand. When New York hit its peak right around April 12, April 15, something like that, that's when New York had its peak of cases. It took 2 full months with strict lockdowns for New York cases to come down. Remember that deaths lag cases by about 15 to 20 days. So by, April, May, June. By mid-June, you finally had this improving in New York. And only in the last 10 days in July have New York's death numbers really finished coming down to, a number that hopefully they won't spike again from. So you take that model, 2 months for cases and then another 15 or so days for deaths. If Arizona and Florida and Texas fully lock down today, if they don't even want to, but if they did that, you're looking at September 15th to get cases under control and October 1st to get what is the coming spike of deaths back under control. They're not willing to do it. I mean, yeah, Greg Abbott now is saying more, you got to wear a mask. But these are not places that seem to have an appetite politically or economically or in any other way for a full lockdown. So Trump recognizes the numbers aren't going to be under control. When you get to 10, 15,000 cases a day, that doesn't just go away in 2 weeks. They are going to be dealing with widespread outbreaks until close to election time. If we have the surging second wave by then, it could be even worse. We're now hearing from the CDC that this fall may be one of the most difficult times in American history from the standpoint of public health. So what can Trump do? Just lie, cover up the data. That's all that they can do. Hide the data, use the data you're willing to publish, which is not accurate, to say we should reopen, reopen in order to make things seem normal so that people will vote for you in the fall. Hopefully the real data makes it out, but this is now taking on the sort of color of a full cover-up, because the actual, remember, it would have been, rather than covering up data, changing reporting procedure, all of this stuff, it would have been much easier to just deal with the virus from the get-go. That's not what this administration chose to do. There's a very interesting side story going on, given that we're talking about coronavirus and Florida and Trump's election. There's a side story that kind of pulls together coronavirus, Florida, Trump, 2020, and more. And the story is about the 2020 Republican National Convention, which is now in jeopardy. And more Republicans are saying, I'm not going to Florida to a huge convention. That doesn't seem safe at all. And Donald Trump is now going to have to balance the risk of holding a mass event in one of the global hotspots, not just national hotspots. Florida is a global coronavirus hotspot. Trump would have to say, what are going to be the optics of doing that? What happens if turnout is terrible? Because that's also the other side of this right now. So to catch you up, the RNC was supposed to be in North Carolina this summer. North Carolina's governor said, you can't do it at full capacity. We just can't, given what's going on with coronavirus. Trump was upset. He moved it to Florida instead. Lunatic Republican Governor Ron DeSantis is like, sure, do whatever you want. The latest news is that many Republicans are saying they're not going to go. Mitt Romney's not going. That's not a huge surprise because he's been one of the most vocal anti-Trump Republicans right now. But other Republicans are bailing as well. Senators Roy Blunt and Pat Roberts said no go. Florida Congressman Francis Rooney is increasingly looking like he's not going to be there. Marco Rubio sounds to be on the fence. He's a senator from Florida. Imagine having an RNC in Florida to nominate Trump, and one of the two senators from that state doesn't go. Senator John Thune, Liz Cheney, there's a lot of Republican elected officials who are saying it's not seeming like a good idea. Republican Senator Chuck Grassley is a question mark. Now, consider the hypocrisy of this, given that Republicans want schools reopened. We had 100,000 active cases in the country in March, April, and it was deemed too dangerous to go to school. So schools were closed. We had 100,000 cases, close it down. We now have 1.8 million active infections, and Republicans are saying, open up the schools, but I'm not going to the convention. That's way too dangerous. And these examples are very widespread. You know, it's too dangerous for Paul Manafort to be in prison because of coronavirus, but all schools should reopen. So this convention thing could end up being a problem at this point for Donald Trump, no matter what. Now we talk about self-inflicted damage. He spent months saying the convention will happen. If it doesn't, he looks weak. So that's potentially a problem for Donald Trump. If he does the convention, there's the problem of spreading coronavirus in a state that is racked with one of the worst outbreaks of coronavirus in the world. If Florida were a country, it would have one of the worst coronavirus outbreaks in the world. And if Trump does it and the turnout is low, he gets the bad optics of spreading coronavirus plus the bad optics of people not showing up. So once again, self-inflicted damage. Now, meanwhile, I don't even care about a Democratic National Convention. I mean, listen, I'm voting for Biden. I know what the right move is in November. I don't need a convention. I don't need debates. It's just such a clear choice. Keep people safe and remove Donald Trump in November. Let's move on. Get Biden inaugurated in January. Hopefully we'll have better functioning therapeutics, more production of monoclonal antibodies, convalescent plasma, maybe an early use vaccine. Hopefully will start to be available. From a circus standpoint, of course, I would love to see the debates. I would love to see the convention. Our live streams would do so well streaming this stuff. But I don't want anybody getting sick and dying. Even the sycophants that would show up to a convention in Florida in the middle of a pandemic would be exactly the people that wouldn't want to wear masks and would be most likely to spread disease. So, you know, I would love to see conventions. They're only every 4 years. I would love to see the debates, but the truth is we don't need them. We all know what the right thing to do is in November. Now, as a reminder, the real reason they want schools open is not for education. It's not for the mental health of the students. It's they need the economy to look normal. Many parents can't work if their kids aren't in school. That's really at the crux of it. If you believe that your reelection hinges on things like things seeming normal. You want schools open because so much depends on schools being open, putting cars back on the road, parents going to work, businesses opening. A lot of it is connected to the daily routine of parents getting their kids to school. That is all that Trump cares about. If you care about health, you've got to look elsewhere. You're not going to get anything health-based from this administration. We have a voicemail number, which I invite you to call absolutely any time of day. That number is 219-2-DAVID-P. Here is a voicemail with a question about maybe how we might interpret the current state of political affairs. Take a look.
Yeah, hey, Dave, I'm going to mention something that nobody's mentioned yet. I believe the Donald Trump presidency is revenge for electing a black man as president, Barack Obama. Tell you what, this is why the Republicans are letting that go. I've never heard this mentioned, and I believe this is true.
Listen, I have heard it mentioned, this idea that the reason Trump got elected is a racist response to Barack Obama. Now, what's really, I'm going to address that in a second. There's a slice of the left that likes to say Barack Obama's centrism and failing the middle class is what got Trump elected. There's people on the left who like to say that in order to then say, as a result, the last thing we need is Joe Biden because it'll just lead to another Donald Trump. I think that this is actually an interesting idea that the caller presents, which is that there was such racist rage about Barack Obama that there are people who would not maybe normally have voted for Donald Trump, but did in order to sort of punish the Democratic Party for electing a black man. I think it exists. I don't know that it's the predominant factor. I do think that there are a lot of race-related elements, including the fear of losing status, as some middle-class white voters may have experienced. I don't think that straight-up racism is really responsible for Donald Trump in the way, racist backlash, I guess we would call it, in the way this caller is referring to. But in a country of 331 million people, there's a little bit of everything, right? James Comey's press conference about Hillary probably swung some votes. Racism in response to Barack Obama probably swung some votes. Russian social media campaigns swung some votes. You can't say that it's one thing, but it's certainly an interesting component. We have a great bonus show planned for you today. Burger King is wanting to address climate change by changing the diets of cows where it gets its meat. What? We'll talk about that. We will also talk about a new study which shows that minimum wage in any U.S. state does not allow you to afford rent. Okay? Horrifying numbers. And I'm actually going to do it. I'm going to talk a little bit about QAnon, canon, as I like to call it sometimes, on today's bonus show. Get instant access to the bonus show at joinpacman.com. Today's bonus show is a good one. Otherwise, I'll see you tomorrow. Thanks so much for watching today's full episode of the show. Just a reminder, today's sponsor is Blinkist, the app that lets you read or listen to an entire nonfiction book in just 15 minutes. You can try Blinkist for free and save 25% off of a subscription when you go to Blinkist.com/David Pakman. I've also included the link right underneath this video.